As we reflect on the Second World War, a staggering statistic often escapes our attention. By the spring of 1945, the Soviet Union had lost over 27 million citizens, both military and civilian, in the war against Nazi Germany. This unfathomable number represents nearly 14% of the Soviet population, a demographic wound that would take generations to heal. The war had been raging for 4 years, with the Eastern Front witnessing some of the most brutal and decisive battles in modern history. By the beginning of 1945, the tide had irreversibly turned against the Third Reich. The Allies had established a solid foothold in Western Europe, and the Soviet Union had been pushing the Germans back on the Eastern Front since the summer of 1944. As the Red Army advanced, it had already liberated a significant portion of Soviet territory, including the crucial cities of Leningrad, Stalingrad, and Kiev. The stage was set for the final act of the war in Europe, with the German capital, Berlin, firmly in the crosshairs of the Soviet military. In the months leading up to the final assault on Berlin, the Soviet High Command, led by Joseph Stalin, had been meticulously planning and preparing for the ultimate showdown with the German army. The Soviets had assembled an overwhelming force of over 2.5 million troops, supported by a massive arsenal of artillery, tanks, and aircraft. The noose was tightening around Berlin, and the city's defenses were on the verge of collapse. As we delve into the story of the fall of Berlin, it's essential to understand the complexities and nuances of the events that led to this pivotal moment in history. As the Soviet forces closed in on Berlin, the city's inhabitants were faced with an unprecedented crisis. With the German army in disarray, the once mighty Wehrmacht was now struggling to maintain a coherent defense. The capital's streets were filled with the sounds of desperation, as soldiers, civilians, and refugees scrambled to escape the impending doom. The city's infrastructure was on the brink of collapse, with food and water shortages becoming increasingly dire. Hospitals were overwhelmed with wounded soldiers, and medical supplies were running perilously low. Meanwhile, the Soviet Air Force, the VVS, had gained complete air superiority, raining down a relentless barrage of bombs on the city's defenses. The very fabric of Berlin was beginning to fray, and the German High Command knew it. They were faced with an impossible decision: to fight on, in the face of overwhelming odds, or to surrender, and risk the wrath of their own leader, Adolf Hitler. The German dictator had made it clear that any talk of surrender would be met with swift and merciless punishment. As the city teetered on the edge of chaos, the inhabitants of Berlin were left to wonder if they would ever escape the abyss that was closing in around them. The problem was clear: how could the city's defenses be maintained, when the very foundations of the German army were crumbling? The clock was ticking, and time was running out for Berlin. As the situation in Berlin continued to deteriorate, the German High Command was faced with a daunting reality: their army was on the brink of collapse. The losses suffered during the grueling winter months had left the Wehrmacht severely depleted, with entire divisions reduced to mere shadows of their former selves. The few remaining units were exhausted, demoralized, and woefully unprepared to face the might of the Soviet war machine. The once mighty German army, which had stormed across Europe with such impunity just a few years prior, was now a mere specter of its former self. Its defenses were crumbling, its leadership was in disarray, and its people were on the brink of starvation. The problem was further compounded by the fact that the city's defenses were largely based on the outdated Festung Berlin, or Fortress Berlin, concept. This defensive strategy, which had been devised in the early years of the war, relied heavily on a series of concentric rings of fortifications, designed to slow down and ultimately repel any would-be attacker. However, this approach had been rendered largely obsolete by the sheer scale and ferocity of the Soviet onslaught. The Soviet army had developed a new tactic, known as the deep battle doctrine, which involved bypassing traditional defensive lines and striking deep into the heart of enemy territory. This approach had proven devastatingly effective, and the German army was struggling to adapt to the new reality. As the situation continued to spiral out of control, the people of Berlin were left to wonder if their city would ever be able to withstand the might of the Soviet army. The once proud capital of the Third Reich was now on the brink of collapse, and its inhabitants were faced with an uncertain and terrifying future. As the situation in Berlin continued to deteriorate, a glimmer of hope emerged in the form of a hastily assembled defense force, known as the Berlin Defense Area. Led by General Gotthard Heinrichsay, a seasoned veteran of the Eastern Front, this motley crew of soldiers, police officers, and Hitler Youth members was tasked with the impossible mission of defending the city against the Soviet juggernaut. Despite being woefully outnumbered and outgunned, General Heinrichsay was determined to make a stand, and he set about implementing a new defensive strategy that would make the most of the limited resources at his disposal. By concentrating his forces on the city's most vital strongpoints, such as the zoo and the Tiergarten, Heinrichsay hoped to create a series of interlocking defensive lines that would slow down the Soviet advance and give the German army time to regroup and counterattack. It was a desperate plan, but it was the only one that stood a chance of success in the face of overwhelming odds. As the people of Berlin waited with bated breath to see if their city would be saved, General Heinrichsay and his men steeled themselves for the battle of their lives. The fate of Berlin hung in the balance, and the world watched with bated breath as the final act of the war in Europe began to unfold. With the Soviet army closing in on all sides, the defenders of Berlin knew that they were running out of time, and that their only hope of survival lay in the success of General Heinrichsay's last-ditch defense plan. As the Soviet army closed in on Berlin, General Heinrichsay's defense plan was put to the ultimate test. The city's defenders, a mix of seasoned veterans and raw recruits, were tasked with holding back the tidal wave of Soviet troops and armor that threatened to engulf them. Heinrichsay's strategy was to funnel the Soviet advance into kill zones, where his artillery and anti-tank guns could inflict maximum damage. The zoo, with its high walls and strategic location, was transformed into a fortress, with German troops dug in behind a labyrinth of trenches and bunkers. The Tiergarten, a sprawling urban park, was similarly fortified, with machine gun nests and anti-tank guns sited to cover the main avenues of approach. As the Soviet army launched its final assault, the defenders of Berlin steeled themselves for the battle ahead, knowing that their city's fate hung precariously in the balance. The Soviet artillery, which had been pounding the city for days, now intensified its bombardment, raining down a maelstrom of shells on the German positions. But Heinrichsay's men held firm, determined to make the Soviet army pay dearly for every inch of ground they gained. As the battle raged on, the people of Berlin huddled in their basements and shelters, praying for a miracle that would save their city from the clutches of the enemy. But as the hours ticked by, it became increasingly clear that the outcome of the battle was far from certain, and that the fate of Berlin hung precariously in the balance. As the battle for Berlin reached its climax, the world watched with bated breath, knowing that the fate of a nation hung in the balance. In the end, it was not the German army's bravery or the Soviet army's might that decided the outcome, but the sheer weight of numbers and the inevitability of history. The Soviet army, having suffered unimaginable losses, finally breached the city's defenses on April 30, 1945. As the Red Army poured into the city, the German resistance began to crumble, and on May 2, the city's garrison surrendered. The fall of Berlin marked the end of an era, the final nail in the coffin of the Third Reich. But it also marked a new beginning, a chance for Germany to rebuild and for Europe to start anew. As we reflect on the events of those fateful days, we are reminded of the devastating cost of war and the importance of preserving peace. The fall of Berlin serves as a poignant reminder of the dangers of extremism and the importance of standing up against tyranny. It is a lesson that we